My name is Youssef. I'm 38 years old, and for much of my life, I believed I knew God. I thought I was on the right path, doing everything I could to please Him, with my words, my fervent prayers, my dedication, and even my sacrifices. For about 15 years, I stood before many, leading prayers in mosques, reciting the Quran with precision, teaching about obedience, total surrender, and devotion. People called me Father and even Sheikh, titles that carried prestige and authority. This filled me with visible pride, but deep down, I carried a restlessness I couldn't silence. I grew up within Islam the way a fish grows in water, unaware of another world beyond it. It wasn't a choice, it was simply life. Islam was the air I breathed, the constant music in the background of my existence from the moment I was born. I remember my childhood clearly, as if it happened yesterday. My first vivid memory is of my father holding my small hand tightly as we walked together to the mosque before sunrise. The early morning was chilly, the streets shrouded in silence, broken occasionally only by the barking of a distant dog. I remember how difficult it was to keep my eyes open, my body still drowsy. But as soon as we walked through the mosque doors and my feet touched that soft, familiar carpet, I felt at home, welcome. I grew up in a devout home, where everything revolved around faith. My father was a strict man, respected by all, someone who didn't need to raise his voice to assert authority. His gaze was enough, and everyone understood. My mother was sweet and serene, always covered up as tradition dictated. She recited verses as she stirred the pots, as if each dish she prepared were a kind of silent prayer. As the eldest son, there was a constant silent pressure on me. I needed to be the example. Carrying the family honor was my responsibility, and there was no room for failure. Memorizing the Quran was only part of what was expected of me, and I fulfilled this mission with zeal. At 13, I was already called Hafi, the one who memorized the holy book. I remember my father's eyes shining with pride, my uncle's wide smiles, my teacher's praise, telling me I was destined for great things. But what felt like an achievement was, to me, a burden too heavy for a teenager to bear. Many nights, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of our small house, repeating verses silently, not out of love, but out of afraid of forgetting a single word and disappointing my father. Afraid that God would punish me for any slip-up. Afraid that my worth as a son and as a human being was entirely tied to my ability. Deep down, I was just a boy wanting to be loved, wanting to be accepted, but what I received was a set of expectations that grew faster than I did. As the years passed, I learned to accept, or at least to play well, the role I was given. Gradually, I began to embrace that identity more naturally. My posture became firmer whenever someone heard me recite. My answers became more confident when questioned. I began to enjoy the respect I received, the admiration in people's eyes. It was as if I had finally found a place in the world, even if that place was built on an image that I felt didn't represent all that was within me. People came to me seeking spiritual counsel, and though I was only a young man, often still struggling with my own doubts, I felt like a wise elder, someone of authority. Pride became a kind of armor that hid my insecurity. Behind my veneer of confidence lay questions I never dared to voice aloud. Does Allah really hear me when I cry quietly into my pillow? Why does He seem so distant when I need Him most? Why does His love always seem tied to my performance? But these were dangerous questions, and so I buried each one deep within myself. At 23, I was officially recognized as a preacher. My life began to revolve entirely around the mosque. There were 5 daily prayers, intense sermons on Fridays, religious classes for the children almost every night. I became a constant voice in that neighborhood, a reference point. My sermons echoed through loudspeakers, crossing streets and windows, and reaching entire families. People said I was firm, that my words carried authority, that I was a blessed young man, a leader with a great future, and I began to believe it. To believe that all of this was enough, that my dedication and my public image were. But what no one saw was what happened when I was alone, away from the eyes of the. Behind the pulpit, my hands sometimes trembled. My voice, which seemed so confident, hid a soul full of uncertainty. I spoke of Allah's mercy as if I knew it intimately, but deep down, I wondered why that mercy always seemed to depend on how well I. Why did she never come spontaneously, like a father who embraces his son even when he makes a mistake? I told the children that paradise was reserved for those who were faithful, obedient, and sincere in their devotion. But when the lights went out and silence fell upon the night, it was as if a voice inside me whispered that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. It was a thought I tried to silence with more prayers, with more effort, with more discipline. I preached Islam with fervor, with true passion, or at least the appearance of it. But inside, there was a hunger that no doctrine seemed to satisfy. It was a hunger for peace that didn't depend on my performance, for security that didn't waver with my successes or failures. I longed with all my might for a God who would welcome me, not threaten me. This longing followed me like a shadow, even when I tried to bury it beneath layers and layers of religious obligations and ministerial activities. When neighbors came to me with questions, I answered firmly, like someone who never wavered. When men much older than me sought guidance, I offered advice readily, as if there were no room for uncertainty within me. On the outside, I was the epitome of faith and stability. On the inside, I was a small child, lost in a dark room, crying softly, unsure if anyone would hear. Try to imagine this for 15 years speaking with conviction about things that, deep down, you're not sure are true. 15 years carrying a spiritual authority that weighs more than your shoulders can bear. 15 years smiling in public while inside you feel hungry. Hunger for something you can't even. That was my reality. But I want you to understand, this story I share is not just about the weight of a religion I carried on my shoulders like armor. It is above all about a God who saw me through all that armor. A God who found me even when I tried to run from my doubts. A God who began to speak to me in ways I could never have imagined. This story is about transformation, a journey from captivity to freedom, from the slavery of fear to the peace that surpasses understanding. It is the passage from the rigidity of religion to the beauty of a personal relationship with God. And I'm not telling this because I'm brave or strong, quite the opposite. I share it because I was weak, because I reached the end of myself. And maybe, just maybe, as you hear this testimony, you'll realize that your own questions, your own pain, your own thirst for something more are mirrored here, in this story. Before I move on, I want to pause. If what I'm saying touches you in any way, if these words are resonating in your heart, I'd like to ask you something simple. Subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave a comment, or share it with someone. And it's not for me. It's not for numbers or visibility. It's because I know there are thousands, perhaps millions of people, exactly like I once was, trapped in silence, swallowing doubts for fear of being judged, with their hearts screaming for. By sharing this video, you can be the instrument God uses to help someone find the freedom they so desperately seek. A simple action of yours can change the destiny of a soul. Now, if you'll allow me, I want to take you back to a very specific moment in my childhood. Because even then, even surrounded by so many rules and demands, there were glimpses, brief but powerful moments, when I felt something different, something pure, something true. I remember one day in particular, when I was about 12 years old. It had rained heavily, and after the storm, I went out into the backyard. The sky was slowly opening, revealing a rainbow that stretched like a colorful bridge from one side of the horizon to the other. My feet still sank into the wet earth, and instinctively, I recited a verse from the Quran that spoke of Allah's signs in creation. But in that instant, something beyond words happened within me. It was as if the sky itself was saying something, not in Arabic, not through commandments, but through love. I felt, for a brief second, as if I were being embraced. Not as a man respected by the community, but as a boy in a father's arm. The feeling was short-lived, soon swallowed up by the routine and expectations that enveloped me like invisible chains. But I never forgot that moment. It was as if God had planted there, amidst all the religious structure, a small seed. A seed that would lie dormant for years, but one day would sprout with strength. And then life went on. I grew into the role I was given. I became respected, consulted, admired. The title of preacher wasn't just a name. It was an identity. I wore this mantle with pride, and also with fear. Fear of failure, fear of disappointment, fear that someone would discover the hunger that still burned within me. Time passed, and my soul continued to cry out for something more. And I had no idea that all of this was about to be turned upside down by a single sentence. A single verse that would pierce my defenses. A verse that would break the chains of more than 15 years of blind dedication. A verse that would change the course of my life forever. I can still see myself that night. It was late, well after midnight. The city slept. The call to dawn prayer was approaching, but I was still awake, restless, staring at the ceiling with heavy eyes, but an awakened soul. That night, I was alone in my small office, a cramped room that felt more like an extension of my mind, overwhelmed, silent, and heavy. I was surrounded by stacks of books. The Quran, my precious collections of hadith, the extensive volumes of tafsir I had read and reread like someone searching for gold in the sand. For many years, these books had been my shield and my sword. They sustained me in discussions, debates, and sermons. With them, I had confronted Christians, silenced atheists, and encouraged wavering Muslims to stand firm in their faith. But on this particular night, something was different. My hands trembled slightly as I leafed through the thin pages. For the first time in over 15 years, I felt as if the Quran, rather than protecting me, was challenging. It was as if it were looking at, not as an ally, but as a mirror. And it all began with a simple question. A young man from the community had approached me after the Friday sermon. I remember his face well, pale, worried, full of doubts he tried to hide out of respect. He was a university student, known for his intelligence and good conduct. He approached me with a serious expression and spoke softly, careful not to be overheard by the others around him. "Father Youssef," he said, almost in a whisper, "why does the Quran say one thing in one place and the opposite in?" I frowned immediately. This kind of question was, for me, a warning sign. "What do you mean by that?" Trying to keep my tone calm but firm. He hesitated, looked around, and then spoke even more quietly. "In Surah Al-Baqarah it says there is no compulsion in religion, but elsewhere it commands us to fight against those who do not believe. Which is the truth?" I was quick to respond. I said that Islamic scholars had been debating this for centuries. I explained the historical context, the verses revealed in Mecca versus those of Medina, the doctrine of abrogation, where later verses replace earlier ones. I said that peace came before power, and war after. He nodded, as if understanding, but his eyes said otherwise. He wasn't convinced. And although I wouldn't admit it to myself at the time, something inside me wasn't either. His doubt found a place within me, however small. And that night, when everyone was asleep and the world seemed silent, I returned to the Quran, not to prepare a sermon, not to counter argument, but to try to find peace for my own soul. I wanted to regain the firmness I'd always had, to reaffirm my faith with the same conviction with which I had taught it for so many years. But what I found was something quite different. I started from where the young man had quoted. I went back to the verse from Surah Al-Baqarah, 222:56. There is no compulsion in religion. It was a verse I had quoted countless times to demonstrate the tolerance and peace of Islam. I knew it by heart, and it had always been helpful in dialogues with non-Muslims. But that night, as I reread those words, something struck me differently. Instead of comfort, I felt conflict. Because the young man's question still echoed in my mind. If there is no compulsion, then why are there so many episodes of coercion, threats, and sanctioned violence in the name of faith? I began to quickly skim through it, searching for other passages, as if I could find a definitive argument that would resolve the dilemma. But what I found was the opposite. Surah At-Tawbah 9:5. And when the sacred months are past, kill the idolaters wherever you find them. Further on in verse 29, fight those who disbelieve in Allah, until they pay the jizya with submission and feel humiliated. My heart sank. It was no longer a matter of misinterpretation. The words were there, clear, and now they sounded like open wounds. The verses were not in harmony with the image of peace and freedom I proclaimed for so many years. And then came the hadiths I also knew so well, texts I had once used as the basis for sermons. But now they sounded like death sentences. I remembered the hadith that said, "Whoever leaves his religion, kill him." I could no longer look away from those words like before. I was paralyzed. The contradiction I had always dodged with academic argument was now staring me in the face like an abyss. There is no compulsion in religion, but also, kill him who abandons the faith. How could these two statements coexist? How could the same God I was taught to love command both? For hours I remained in that state. Sweat dripped down my forehead as my mind tried to piece together explanations, and my lips murmured familiar recitations, Arabic verses that had always been like shields to me. But something had changed. For the first time my words felt empty, and my heart didn't respond. What had once been certainty was now silence. And in that silence, I felt as if I had been betrayed, not by the paper, nor by religion itself, but by something deeper. It was as if the book I loved had turned against me, or perhaps it was simply revealing to me what I had refused to see for so many years. The next morning, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I prepared for the day, walked to the mosque, and ascended the pulpit as I had for years. I delivered the sermon with a firm voice and confident gestures, conveying authority and conviction. To outsiders, I was the same leader I'd always been, confident, unwavering, full of faith. But inside, my world was crumbling into silence. My eyes roamed the rows of kneeling men, their foreheads touching the ground in surrender, their hearts trusting me to guide them. And there, in that moment, I found myself wondering how many of them harbored doubts they would never dare reveal. How many secretly wondered the same questions that young student had asked me, and which now echoed powerfully. I knew the rules well. Questions like that were considered dangerous. Doubt was seen as poison. A single whisper of disbelief could cost everything: your reputation, your place in the community, your freedom, even your life. As an imam, I myself had silenced many who asked too many questions. I told them they were being tempted by Satan, that true faith does not question. I corrected them firmly, convinced I was doing God's will. But now, that same whisper I said came from the devil was inside my own mind. Or perhaps it was something more. That night, unable to find rest, I returned to the same verse. My eyes were tired, burning, but I couldn't look away. There is no compulsion in religion. I knew these words by heart, had recited them countless times, but now they struck me as a cruel irony. Because the reality of Islam I had lived was anything but free. My own story was a testament to this. From childhood, my faith had been forced upon me, not as a gift, but as an obligation. I remember times when I was forced to pray, even without understanding why. I remember the spankings for mispronunciations while reciting verses. I remember the constant fear of making a mistake in front of my father, of forgetting a passage, of failing to memorize. Fasting was more of a burden than an act of love. My faith was never born of choice, but of fear. Fear of punishment, of rejection, of shame. And what tore me apart was the realization that I had done the same to others. For 15 years, I taught with conviction, telling myself I was saving souls. But in truth, I was only reinforcing the very chains that had bound me. I could no longer hide from. That verse wasn't just an apparent theological contradiction. It had become, for me, an open wound. Every time I read it, it was as if the book itself was saying one thing, but religion, something else entirely. As the days passed, the verse haunted me. I began to see cracks in everything around me, cracks that had always been there, but which I refused to see. When I visited families in the community, I saw the fear in the children's eyes. Mothers forced their children to recite the Quran mechanically, as if repeating a formula to avoid punishment. Fathers demanded blind obedience, as if questioning were a sin. Wives lived in silence, covering themselves not just out of modesty, but out of imposition, out of fear. Islam said there was no compulsion, but compulsion was everywhere. It was in the homes, in the looks, in the unspoken rules. It was in our mosques, in our marriages, in our systems. And then, one of those nights, as I walked home through the narrow streets, I heard two teenagers talking quietly in a dark alley. One of them said matter-of-factly, "If you ever abandon Islam, they'll kill you." The other laughed, a little nervously, but I didn't laugh, because I knew it was true. I had preached it myself. That night, something broke inside me. I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my room, locked the door, turned off the lights, and fell to my knees. But it wasn't the ritual position of wrong. There was no carpet, no direction to, no rehearsed repetitions. For the first time in my, I spoke to God, without fear of. I spoke like a lost child, like someone drowning, gasping. I whispered, "Allah, if you are real, show me. If this book is truly yours, explain to me why it contradicts itself. Why does it say freedom but demand strength? Why do I feel suffocated when I should feel at peace? I need to know. I can't bear living like this anymore." And then, silence, a deep, cruel silence. No answer came, no sign, just the same verse repeating in my mind like a mocking echo. For the first time, I faced the possibility that the God I served might not be who I believed him to. Weeks passed like this. I continued to fulfill my role in public, leading prayers, teaching the children, visiting the faithful. But inside, I was a wreck. I felt like a house about to collapse. My wife noticed. "You've been so quiet lately," she commented as she prepared. "Is everything okay? Are you sick?" I forced a smile, as I always do. "I'm just tired," I lied. But it wasn't tiredness. It was terror. It was the fear that everything I believed in was crumbling before me. I knew that if I admitted my doubts, even to her, I could lose everything. My marriage, my children, my honor, my position. What sustained me on the outside was deeply intertwined with a faith that was now crumbling the inside. But the more I tried to silence the voice within me, the more the verse pressed on my soul like an impossible burden. I could no longer run away. There was no turning back. One night, something different happened. I had a dream. It was intense, vivid, more real than many moments in my waking life. I found myself alone in a vast desert, completely surrounded by sand and silence. The sky above was wide, cloudless, and a hot wind blew, raising small clouds of dust. In my hands, I held the open Quran. I tried to read it, as I always did, but the words began to blur before my eyes. They dissolved like wet ink, until they turned to dust and were carried away by the wind. I panicked. I fell to my knees in the sand, feeling completely lost. Then, in the distance, a light appeared. It wasn't the harsh glare of the desert sun. It was a soft, golden light, carrying with it an inexplicable peace. And from within that light, a figure emerged. Strong, yet gentle. Commanding, yet welcoming. I couldn't see his face clearly, as if it were covered by a veil of glory, but I heard his voice. She was firm and sweet, calm and yet powerful. He said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I woke up trembling. My eyes were wet. My heart was pounding so hard it seemed to echo in the room. Those words wouldn't leave my mind. They had stuck with me like something eternal, something that transcends time and space. And strangely, I knew I had never heard them before. They weren't part of the Quran. They weren't from any hadith. Later, with my heart still pounding, I would discover that those words were from Jesus, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. It was as if heaven had whispered something directly to my heart. From that dream on, everything began to change. It was as if my heart, for the first time, was recognizing a truth it had always sought but never found. Peace, freedom, relief. What Islam couldn't give me, that simple phrase offered me, not as a doctrine, but as an invitation. The verse that had previously cast me into doubt was now the key that unlocked a new door. If Islam wasn't the truth, maybe, just maybe, there was another way, and maybe that path had a name. At the same time, I knew what it meant. If anyone knew of my dream, if anyone discovered the questions now burning in my heart, everything could end. My position, my livelihood, my honor, my very safety, all would be at risk. Yet that very night, something inside me refused to back down. I sat at my desk, the Quran before me, as I had so many times before. I looked at the book with reverence, but also with weariness. I ran my fingers along the edges of the pages, as if saying goodbye to something beloved, but too heavy to carry any longer. My lips, almost in lament, repeated, "There is no compulsion in religion." And then, I slowly closed the book and pushed it away from me. I didn't know what would come next. I didn't know what to expect, nor where to find the answer. But I knew this. I could no longer live a lie. That verse, which I had once defended so fervently, had not protected Islam. It had exposed it. And now my soul yearned for something truly free, something greater, something real. For all those years, the Quran had been my foundation. I knew it cover to cover. I memorized dozens of surahs. I preached its teachings with passion and zeal. It was my compass, my pride, my identity. I carried it like armor. I silenced Christians in debates, confronted skeptics and atheists with its rhetoric, and pointed to its linguistic miracles as indisputable proof of its divine origin. For 15 years, my soul was entwined with defending the honor of this book. But everything began to crumble with just one verse. It wasn't a sudden fall, like a bolt of lightning splitting the sky. It was a slow process, like a loose thread in a garment that seems insignificant until you pull it and see the entire structure unravel. I was in the middle of this unraveling, trying to stay afloat. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was preparing my sermon for the Friday prayer. The theme would be obedience. Obedience to Allah. Obedience to the Prophet. Obedience to the Quran. I planned to reinforce how Islam was a religion of justice and balance, how it promoted family harmony, mutual respect, and dignity for all. I wanted to sound modern, enlightened, like someone who understood the times but remained firm in tradition. I reviewed several passages, searching for references to family, and then, my eyes landed on a verse I had quoted countless times, Surah An-Nisa 4:34. In the past, I had read it confident, convinced of its wisdom, but that day, it was different. The words leaped from the page like an arrow to the heart. Men are the protectors and maintainers of women. As for those whose disobedience you fear, admonish them, keep them away from you in bed, and beat them. I stood still. The Arabic word was undeniable. Beat. Idribuhun. Why? Why was this here? For years I had sugarcoated this passage. I repeated explanations I'd been taught, that it was symbolic, that it meant a mild, almost metaphorical. I said it was a last resort, that there was context. I had rehearsed these defenses to perfection, but now, no excuse made sense. Sitting there before the Quran, with that sentence pulsing before me, I could no longer pretend. My heart screamed inside. This is not justice. This is not love. This is not God. Images began to flood my mind. Familiar faces, beloved faces. I saw my mother, that silent woman who, for years, hid her sadness behind a restrained smile. I saw my sisters, submissive, careful, always avoiding displeasing. I saw my wife, who so often remained silent in the face of actions that hurt her. And suddenly, I remembered my cousin. The image of her sitting at our table, a visible bruise on her face, came back with a vengeance. She had been corrected by her husband. We all knew it, but no one said anything. I remembered standing silently, simply watching, as my uncle said with cruel Allah has given us permission. I remembered the counseling sessions I myself had led at the mosque. The silent tears of the women came back to me, and also the words I had spoken to them in a firm voice. Be patient, obey, trust in Allah. And there, in that moment, all those memories ceased to be scenes of the past. They became heavy bricks pressing down on my chest, crushing me with guilt. And then I thought of her, my daughter, my little girl, so pure, so full of life, so innocent. A soul yet unaware of the horrors of the world, and I wondered, would I ever have the courage to tell her that if her husband beat her, it was permitted by God, that her dignity was secondary to man's authority, that her tears were an acceptable sacrifice to uphold a supposedly sacred revelation? The thought destroyed me. It was unbearable. I felt as if something inside me was crumbling. I couldn't breathe properly. For hours, I struggled with those words. I opened the tafsirs, sought solace in the scholar's commentary. I desperately tried to find a loophole, an explanation, something to ease the lump in my throat. But instead of comfort, I found despair. The scholars I had admired for years only worsened my anguish. Some justified beatings without hesitation, as if they were a natural human right. Others tried to soften the blow, but still didn't deny the practice. Ibn Kathir, Al-Sabar, Al-Qurtub, names I revere, all confirmed what I feared. The verse was clear. The word was beating. It wasn't a mistranslation. It wasn't a misinterpretation. It was there, naked, raw, undeniable. For the first time, I dared to whisper a phrase that burned my lips. What if this book is not from God? That question sank into my soul like poison. Doubt felt like a crime against everything I was. My life, my faith, my name, my position, my family's honor. Everything was tied to Islam. The Quran was the foundation, and if that foundation were cracked, everything I had built would fall with it. I tried to suppress it. I slammed the book shut and prayed harder than ever. Astaghfirullah, forgive me Allah for doubting. Strengthen my faith. Take this restlessness from my heart. But the words that came out of my mouth felt hollow, echoing back as if God weren't listening. I felt like someone crying out inside a cave, where the sound only bounces off the walls. For days, I carried that verse inside me like a burning ember, burning my insides. I preached the Friday sermon as I always did. My voice was firm on the outside, but inside, I trembled. I told the congregation that Islam honored women, that the Quran was perfect, that obedience brought peace. But every word I spoke felt like a betrayal of my conscience. I felt like an imposter, a man in a suit, clean-shaven, reciting truths I no longer believed. That night, I made a decision. I sat beside my wife on the edge of the bed. My hands were cold and trembling. I need to tell you something, I whispered, my voice almost broken. She looked at me with concern, as if sensing something important was about to be revealed. I picked up the Quran, opened it to Surah 434, and pushed the book toward her. This is eating me up, I confessed. How could this have come from God? She looked at the verse, then back at me. She frowned in confusion, but remained silent. But we've always been told, she began. I know what we've been told, I interrupted, tears welling in my eyes. But listen to me. Think of the women who suffer in silence because of this. Think of our daughter. Would you accept her husband one day disciplining her like this, in the name of God? She hesitated. Her lips trembled. No, she whispered. That no, small, restrained, but genuine, was like a crack in the prison wall where my soul was imprisoned. It was the first ray of light amidst the darkness. She didn't argue. She didn't recite excuses. She didn't quote tafsir. She simply saw what I saw. She recognized what I recognized. That verse didn't align with love. It didn't align with justice. It didn't align with God. And from that moment on, I couldn't close my eyes. The verse haunted me at breakfast, at the mosque, at night, during prayers. It was the thorn in my side, the splinter that wouldn't let my soul rest. And then, as if God were opening another window, something unexpected happened. One night, with everyone asleep, I sat in front of my computer. I secretly browsed the internet, trying to find solace. I wasn't looking for attacks on Islam. I already knew the argument and refuted them easily. But that night, I found something different. It wasn't a forum. It wasn't a debate. It was a testimony. A man like me, who had experienced the same questions, the same dilemmas, the same pain. He too had abandoned Islam, not out of rebellion, but out of sincere searching. He spoke of Jesus, of love, of forgiveness, of a God who didn't command submission out of fear, but who extended his arms to the weary. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone. He had written something that resounded in my gut like thunder. If God is love, he cannot command men to beat women. Those words, so simple and direct, exploded within me as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. It was at that precise moment that something inside me broke. It was when my heart, for the first time, turned toward Christ. Christ, the name that had so often fallen from my mouth as a mockery. The figure I had taught for years was a lie, a twisted prophet, part of a corrupted religion. And yet, in that instant, the name no longer sounded like an enemy. It sounded like an invitation, a gentle, almost silent, yet irresistible call. It was as if a door had been opened ajar within me, a door to something I had never known. Peace without fear, faith without oppression, love without demand. Startled by the intensity of that moment, I hurriedly closed my laptop. The sound of the lid slamming echoed through the room like a warning. Fear enveloped, fear of discovery, fear of what was beginning to sprout with. But the seed had already been planted in the soil of my soul, and no matter how hard I tried to bury it or drown it under the obligations of religion, it began to germinate. I remember that day as if it were carved into my chest. The sun hid behind the mosque's minarets, painting the sky with burnt orange hues, as if heaven itself were watching what was about to happen to me. I had spent hours preparing yet another sermon, with notes filled with verses from the Quran, detailed references to hadith, and arguments I had already memorized like poetry. It was just another ordinary day for someone respected, admired, and whose name was synonymous with authority. And yet, inside, I was on the verge of collapse. That night, everything began to fall apart, and it began almost imperceptibly. I sat in my office, as it had so often before. The room plunged into darkness. The light from my lamp focused on the pages of the Quran. My fingers glided over the Arabic words with familiarity, and my lips recited silently. It was something I had done since I was a child, with pride, with reverence, with a deep sense of identity. But then, a verse I had read many times before, and even quoted in sermons, jumped off the page differently, as if, for the first time, it were staring back at me. Surah An-Nisa 4:34. The text began to transform before me, not as wisdom, but as an uncomfortable mirror revealing something I didn't want to see. Men are responsible for women. Those you fear will rebel. Admonish them. Abandon them to bed and beat them. The final word hung in the air like poison. Beat them. It pierced me with a violence no other reading had ever caused. My hands began to tremble. My mouth went dry. As if being read for the first time, I recited it softly. In Arabic, idribuhunna, and it was as if a knife cut through the silence of the room. The image of my wife came to mind immediately. Her gentle smile, her calm voice, her silent faithfulness through all these years. I thought of my daughter, her bright eyes when she saw me come home, the way she would run into my arms. And now this verse said that if I feared disobedience, I could hit her. Was this God's command? Something began to shatter inside me. A fierce conflict gripped my chest. I wanted to retreat. I wanted to rationalize, as I always had. I wanted to repeat the arguments I'd been trained with. It's not literal, it's symbolic. It's a light rebuke, almost without contact. I whispered these explanations to myself like an incantation. No, that's not it. It can't be that. But I knew the language. I'd studied Arabic for years. I'd taught grammar. I'd interpreted classical texts. I knew the root of the word. And even worse, I knew the context. I knew it wasn't a mistranslation. It wasn't a Western distortion. The word was there, raw, direct, and violent. And this time, I couldn't escape it. I knew exactly what the interpretation he said. I had read the traditional interpretations of each line, memorized the arguments, repeated them to others countless times. But in that moment, as the verse echoed in my mind like distant thunder, all of it seemed empty. I sat at the table, placed my hands on my head, and closed my eyes tightly. My heart screamed with an anguish I had never experienced before. How can this come from God? How can the one who created love command me to hurt the one I swore to protect? I stood up abruptly, as if the air were choking me, and began pacing aimlessly, as if movement could silence that voice inside me. I had defended this verse to so many people, so many times, but now, I couldn't even defend it to myself. It wasn't the first text that bothered me, but this was the first that truly hurt. This one was personal. It was about my wife, my daughter, my dignity. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my forehead sweaty and my chest tight. The darkness seemed to swallow me. Every time I closed my eyes, my daughter's face appeared before me. Those big, innocent eyes, so full of life. I imagined her one day, married to a man who used this same verse to justify violence. I imagined someone saying to her, "Obey your husband, or be beaten because God said so." That broke me inside. My soul ached with indescribable depth. The next morning, I walked to the mosque as if carrying stones on my back. My feet seemed to sink with each step. The community members greeted me joyfully, as they always did. "Imam, salam alaikum." Children came running to me, wanting a blessing, a smile, and I smiled. But it was a fake smile, fragile. Inside, I felt like an imposter. When I stood before the congregation to preach, the words came out of my mouth automatically, but my heart wasn't there. I said that Islam was perfect, that the Quran was clear, that God was just. But a nagging, almost unbearable voice whispered inside me, "If it is right, why does it order us to do what is wrong?" The contradiction grew in me like a crack in a mirror, and it was spreading. The next few days were a sea of confusion. I tried to fight what they called doubt. I read interpretation after interpretation. I attended debates between Muslim scholars and apologists. I spoke with older men, men I respected, spiritual leaders. Each gave me rehearsed answers. It's not violence, it's symbolic, it's a light touch, it's loving discipline. But the more I listened, the more my soul stirred. How could anyone call a slap mercy? How could pain be an instrument of love? How could something that humiliates be attributed to God? It was like trying to repair a cracked dam with duct tape. The structure was giving way. My conscience screamed, begging for air. I could no longer deny it. This was wrong. One night, alone in my study, I sat before the Quran with trembling hands and red eyes. The book was open, but the pages seemed distant. My voice cracking, I whispered to the ceiling, Allah, if you are real, if you are truly just and merciful as they say, then explain this. Show me how this can be yours, because right now I don't see justice here. I see pain. There was a deep silence, and then quietly, as if pushing away my own fear, I said something I never would have imagined saying. What if you're not who I thought you? What if this book isn't yours? That question cut me more than any previous doubt. It was as if it had touched the most raw nerve in my soul. For 15 years I had preached certainty. He told others that their questions were proof of weak faith. He said doubts were the work of Shaitan. Now, I was the man in the dark, begging for an answer, and all I heard was the echo voice. I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff, the ground crumbling. The verse wasn't just a stumbling, it was the hammer blow that cracked the foundation of everything I believed. Suddenly, other memories began to surface like waves crashing on the shore. Contradictions I had buried, violence I had justified, passages that made me uncomfortable, but which I ignored in the name of obedience. The emptiness I had always felt, but which I hid under the weight of religious duty. I remembered the boy I had been, still small, reciting verses from the Quran beside my father, with pride in my chest, and no doubt in my eyes. I believed, with all my heart, that this was the only truth. I remembered all the people I had preached to, begging them to submit, promising them eternal rewards. And now, for the first time I asked myself, what if I was wrong? What if instead of freeing, I was chaining people? The weight of this possibility was almost unbearable. That night I cried like a child. I cried until the pages of the Quran beneath me were soaked with tears. I felt betrayed by the religion that shaped my life, by the scholars who taught me, by the tradition that gave me a name. I no longer knew who I was. My wife came into the room and found me, hunched over, my face buried in my hands. She knelt beside me and gently touched my shoulder. "Are you sick?" she whispered, concern in her eyes. I wanted to scream, to say it all, to tear my heart out in front of her, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain that everything I'd taught, everything I'd stood for, was crumbling inside me? I just shook my head and murmured, "I am fine." But I wasn't. I was crumbling inside, slowly, like a condemned building. That night has remained etched in my soul as the moment the foundation of my faith to crack. The verse I had read was like a hammer striking repeatedly at the foundation of what I believed, and I felt my world slowly crumbling around me. I had no idea where this tortuous road, but I knew one thing: I would never again be able to open the Quran in the same way, with the same conviction I had before. I remember that night as if it were happening now. The mosque was silent after evening prayers. The murmur of the worshippers had already dispersed, and I was left alone. Sitting in the dim light of the lamp, the Quran opened before me. For so many years those words had been my life. I had memorized them, recited them confidently, and shared them with hopeful boys and girls who looked to me as a guide, a man who had faith and answers. I firmly told myself that this was the absolute truth, God's final revelation to humanity. But that night, something inside me kept stirring in my heart. A voice whispered, barely audible, "Read it again. Don't just recite it. Really try to understand it." For weeks I had been wrestling with unanswered questions. Why did the Quran speak of Jesus in such contradictory ways in different passages? Why was he exalted, the Word of God, and his Spirit, yet at the same time treated as just an ordinary prophet? Why was it that reading about the angels brought me peace? But as I continued, everything seemed confusing, even disturbing. And then, as if by chance, I stumbled upon a verse that changed everything. Surah Al-Imran 3:55. I read the words, "O Jesus, verily, I will take you, and raise you to myself, and purify you from the unbelievers." I froze, my gaze fixed on the words. I read them over and over again, almost in disbelief. "I will take you, I will raise you," I whispered to myself, my heart racing. If Jesus never died and was taken to God, does that mean he is still alive? That he is not buried like the other prophets? This thought shook me deeply. All the prophets I knew, Moses, David, Muhammad, were dead, their bodies resting underground, their tombs open to visit. But Jesus, he was alive, exalted, purified, ascending to heaven. I felt my hand pressed against my chest, my heart pounding, confused, and at the same time, fascinated. Why would Allah choose to take Jesus like this, alone? Why not Muhammad? Why not Moses or Abraham? The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as my mind whirled with restless thoughts. If Jesus is alive, where is he now? If he has been taken, will he return? And if he does, what does that mean for my faith, for Islam as the ultimate truth? These questions haunted me. That night, my faith, that certainty I carried like armor, cracked. For 15 years I had preached Islam with all my fervor. I silenced those who doubted, rebuked those who questioned, and warned those who tried to think beyond the rigid confines of doctrine. But now, I was the one trembling with fear, the one whispering forbidden questions, the one seeking answers no one seemed to have. I closed the Quran, but the words of that verse still echoed loudly within my mind. I tried to convince myself that the passage had another interpretation, that scholars explained it differently, that the meaning wasn't literal. But no matter how many times I opened other books, how many debates I watched, or how many opinions I sought, I couldn't escape the simple, clear truth: Jesus wasn't dead. That verse became a thorn in my spirit, cutting deeply through years of indoctrination and teachings I had accepted as unquestionable. It haunted me as I walked home alone under the dark, silent sky. It followed me until the moment sleep finally overtook me. And that night, I dreamed of a light so intense and pure that it seemed to pierce the shadows of my room, illuminating everything within me that I couldn't yet comprehend. In the dream, I saw a man dressed in white, with a look of such profound peace that it seemed to radiate calm throughout my being. His face conveyed a serenity I had never experienced, and he extended his hand to me like a silent invitation. He didn't utter a single word, but within my soul echoed clear and firm words. I am alive. I am the way. I woke with a start, my body drenched in sweat, the pillow soaked with silent tears. For the first time in my life, a crushing truth hit me. I was preaching a religion that deep down couldn't save me. That insistent verse wouldn't let me escape. It felt as if God himself had placed it there, deep in my heart, challenging me to seek the truth, even if it meant confronting everything I'd believed until then. And that was when the most intense internal war I'd ever faced began. Would I have the courage to cling to the faith on which I'd built my entire identity? Or would I have the courage to follow that whisper of truth, so fragile and threatening, that promised to undo all my certainties? At that moment, I still didn't have clear answers. But one thing was undeniable. The chains that bound me began to break. I remember that night as if it were etched into every fiber of my soul. Everything seemed normal at first. My desk cluttered with books, the Quran open before me, my mind heavy with the responsibility I felt. For 15 years I had been the voice the community admired, the guide who answered difficult questions, the man who officiated weddings, mediated disputes, and comforted the bereaved. But inside, I carried an invisible wound no one saw. For months, I had wrestled with questions I still hadn't the courage to voice. How could I preach mercy when I felt my own heart saw only cruelty? How could I speak of peace when fear dominated so many lives around me? Everything changed when I was preparing a sermon on obedience. My intention was clear. I wanted to choose a verse that would silence the restless young people in our mosque, those who were beginning to question. They asked why Islam seemed to demand so much fear and so little love, why women carried symbols that resembled chains, and why prayers seemed empty and meaningless. I wanted to remind them of Allah's authority, to reaffirm their faith. But when I opened the Quran that night, I stumbled upon a verse I had read countless times, but that time it pierced me like a sharp blade. Era of Surat At-Tawbah, 9:1-11. Indeed, Allah has purchased from the believers their lives and property in exchange for paradise. They fight in the cause of Allah, then they kill and are killed. I froze. The words seemed to leap off the page, screaming at me. Kill and be killed. Something inside me broke in that instant. Was this the truth of the God I had served my entire life? A God who demanded blood in exchange for paradise? A God who glorified violence as the greatest sign of devotion? I sat there, trembling, as my world crumbled around me. I remembered the faces of the young men I had taught, faces now buried in the earth because they believed death would guarantee them heaven. I remembered the mothers who kissed their children goodbye, thinking they were offering sacrifices to Allah. I remembered my own sermons, my voice, repeating the same words, never questioning. That verse wasn't new to me, but that night, it became unbearable. It was as if a veil had been ripped from my eyes, revealing the ugliness I had chosen to ignore for so long. I whispered to myself, if this is the God I believe in, then why is my soul sick? Why do I feel like I'm betraying the very humanity He created within me? The tears came uncontrollably, and I closed the Quran, for the first time afraid of the words that had, for so long, been the foundation of my life. I spent the night awake, unable to find rest, My mind was immersed in a whirlwind of memories that haunted me relentlessly. I recalled every child I had taught to memorize verses about unquestioning obedience, every couple I had urged to endure suffering with resignation, saying that Allah tested his faithful, and every young man to whom I had extolled jihad as an act of honor and devotion. I felt like an invisible killer, bearing the weight of having led others to spiritual destruction, even without carrying weapons. The next morning, as I walked to the mosque, I walked as if carrying an unbearable burden, an invisible coffin resting on my shoulders, my chest burning under a suffocating weight, while my throat closed with anguish. I tried to prepare my heart to preach as I always had, with confidence and conviction, but the words wouldn't. That verse, insistent and cruel, invaded my mind, making any semblance of certainty impossible. When I finally stood before the congregation, I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My tongue felt heavy, betraying everything I had preached so far. Unable to bear it, I closed the Quran in public and muttered something about feeling unwell. Slowly walking away, I left behind confused murmurs and suspicious glances. It was then that I began to crumble inside, and I knew my downfall was only beginning. But that night, something even stranger happened to me. I dreamed I was lost in a vast desert, where the cracked ground beneath my feet cried out for water and life. The air was thick with dust, and everything seemed dry and desolate. I was clutching the Quran tightly, but when I opened it, to my surprise and despair, the pages were completely blank. I screamed, but my voice faded into the silence of the void. Then a light appeared in the distance, growing brighter until it tore through the darkness surrounding me. I tried to shield my eyes from the intensity of that brightness, but the light pulled me in, drawing me closer. Amidst this brilliance, a figure appeared before me, dressed in white, with a serene and radiant countenance, imbued with a peace I had never experienced, but also with a silent and imposing strength. Then I heard a voice, not harsh or demanding, but soft, deep, and full of tenderness and power. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. These words struck me like a blazing fire, awakening something deep within me. I had never read the Bible before, but that phrase, I knew, was from it. My heart burned with an inexplicable warmth, an emotion I had never felt in all my years of dedicated religious service. The figure looked at me, not with judgment, but with a love that saw all my failures, all the lies I'd told, all the sermons I'd preached, and still welcomed. In the dream, I fell to my knees, in tears, and when I woke, my pillow was wet with real tears. That morning, a certainty settled in. I could no longer pretend everything was okay. The verse that had destroyed my faith in Islam had also opened a crack, allowing another voice, of truth, love, and life, to enter my heart. But along with this revelation, what would my wife think? What about my children? What about the young people I taught? How would the community react to discovering their spiritual leader had lost his faith? I knew the price to pay. I had witnessed others disappear, rejected, silenced, and isolated. Yet something inside me whispered, "You have already been found. Do not fear him who can kill the body, but fear him who has power over the soul." I closed my eyes and uttered the most courageous prayer of my life. Jesus, if you are real, show me the truth. Even if it costs me everything, I want to know you. That prayer marked the end of an old life and the hesitant beginning of a new journey. I thought that perhaps if I remained silent, seeking the truth for myself alone, without causing a stir, I might find some peace. But silence has a cruel way of betraying, and I knew my search for answers was just beginning. People notice, family notices, and in my world, rumors travel faster than the wind in a storm. It was a Friday, right after prayer, when my Imam, my mentor, my guide for 15 long years, took me aside. His eyes were like live coals, charged with fire and judgment. He spoke softly, almost whispering, so no one else could hear, but each word cut like a sharp blade. "Brother Yusuf," he said, squeezing my shoulder with a force that almost hurt. "There are rumors. They say you've been questioning everything, reading forbidden books, mixing with Christians. Tell me it's not true." I froze in that instant. My mind screamed at me to deny it, to say it was all a lie, but my stubborn mouth refused to form those words. For the first time in my life, I couldn't lie to protect my skin. I looked at the ground, and my silence spoke for me. The Imam's hand fell from my shoulder, as if I'd poisoned him. His face contorted in rage, a rage that burned brighter than the midday sun. "You shame me. You shame Islam. 15 years by my side, preaching and praying together, and now you betray us. You betray Allah." His voice rose, firm, for the elders around him to hear. "A wolf in sheep's clothing. This man has allowed the devil to corrupt his heart." My blood ran cold. I knew exactly what this meant. Being called a traitor in this environment was a spiritual death sentence, a stigma I would carry forever. When I got home, my wife's face was pale. her expression etched with worry. She had already heard the rumors. "What have you done, Yusef?" she whispered. "They're going to come after us." That night, sitting alone in the dark corner of my room, my body trembling, I didn't raise my hands to Allah, as I always had. Instead, I cried out to Jesus, my voice thick with fear and hope. "Lord, if you are real, if you are truly who I saw in that dream, protect me. I don't know what will happen, but I can't go back. I can't close my eyes to the truth." And there, in the darkness, I felt something rare, a gentle yet firm peace, like a hand resting tenderly on my back saying, "Don't be afraid, I am with you." This peace didn't stop the storm that was coming, but it prepared me to face it. The summons happened quickly. I was taken, almost dragged, before the council of our town's elders. My father was among them, sitting like a stone statue, refusing to meet my gaze. My brother, arms crossed, stared at me as if I had ceased to be part of the family, as if I were no longer blood of the same blood. The Imam wasted no time. He shouted verses from the Quran about apostates who deserved death. He called me a disgrace, a disease that needed to be eradicated before it infected it. "Confess!" he roared. "Say you were deceived. Spit on this false Jesus and return to Islam, or you won't see the sunrise tomorrow." My knees trembled, sweat dripping from my forehead. Every eye, which had previously regarded me with respect, now burned with hatred. And in that moment, I remembered the verse that had shattered my soul, the one that said, "If you have any doubts about what we ask those who have read the scriptures before you." That verse pointed me to the Bible, to a truth that escaped the narrow walls of Islam. I couldn't deny what it said, couldn't deny what my heart already knew. Then, with a trembling but resolute voice, I lifted my head and said, "I cannot deny what I have seen. I cannot deny the peace I have found in Jesus. Kill me if you, but I will not lie." The silence that followed felt crushing. My father stood up suddenly, his face red with shame and rage. "No longer my son," he spat. "May Allah curse you." Those words cut deeper than any sword, tearing at my soul in a way no physical wound ever could. I felt my soul shatter into 1,000 pieces, as if each fragment took a piece of my being. But even amidst that crushing pain, an unexpected strength began to grow within me, a strength I couldn't explain, a faint light amidst the darkness. That same night, my wife, her eyes brimming with tears, silently packed a small suitcase. "They're coming for you, Yusef," she whispered, her voice choked with fear and love. "You have to leave. For our children, you have to run." Tears blurred my vision as I kissed my children's forehead, feeling the weight of uncertainty crush my chest. I had no idea if I would ever see them again. I left that night with a heavy heart, carrying only a phone with a Bible app, a few clothes crammed into a makeshift backpack, and a mixture of fear and faith battling. They were coming after me like relentless predators. I ran through narrow alleys, across dark fields, down to a dry riverbed, and behind me, their screams pierced the silence of the night. "Catch the traitor! Don't let him escape!" My legs ached. My lungs burned with every breath, but I kept running. Every step was driven by a desperate plea. "Jesus, help me." At one point, I stumbled, falling hard on sharp rocks. My body shook with pain, and fear tightened my throat. It could be the end right there. If they caught up with me, they would beat me, perhaps kill me right there. I could already imagine my blood staining the arid ground. But then, something unexpected happened. In the midst of that deathly silence, a voice emerged. Not from the outside world, but from deep within my soul. It was calm, firm, impossible to mistake. It said, "Even though you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you will fear no evil, for I am with you." Those words shocked me. I had never read that verse before, but only much later did I learn it came from the Bible. In that moment, however, it was as if heaven itself was speaking directly to my fear, enveloping me in invisible protection. Rising, still unsteady, I looked back and saw that the men had stopped. They scattered, confused, shouting at each other, searching in opposite directions. Somehow I had disappeared from their reach. I slipped into the silent night, my heart racing and tears streaming down my face. "Thank you, Jesus. You really are with me." The days slowly turned into weeks. I hid first with distant relatives and then moved from place to place, always alert, always looking over my shoulder. I was a fugitive in the very land I had once called home. Yet as I hid, something grew within me. God's word took root ever deeper in my heart. Each verse I read was like a balm, a living water that quenched my soul's thirst for truth and hope.